Awesome. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this week's Product School Talk. I'm Cassandra with Product School. As you guys know, we teach product management, data, and coding at our 14 campuses. I have a very special guest with us today. Her name is Ariel Butters. She's a product manager at Omaze. Hi, Ariel. How are you doing today?
I'm good. How are you?
Doing well, thanks. So glad to have you with us today. Before we begin, could you give us a little bit of your history and how you broke into product management?
Sure. So I actually come from a media background by education. I moved to LA about 5 years ago and started working at a company called ZEFR. And while I was there, I started on sort of a media track and then really quickly realized that I had a passion for product management and ended up actually working on a lot of ZEFR's tools. And really just learned the trade from working. So I've worked on B2B products, B2C products, and now I'm at Omaze, which is a fundraising platform for nonprofits.
Awesome, thanks. Well, I know you have a presentation prepared and everything, so we're all set up to go. Before you take over, just want to let everybody know we're going to be taking questions right after her presentation, so be prepared to type them in right under the video. So I'll let you take it from here. Thanks, Ariel.
Cool, thank you. So as I mentioned, I have worked on a number of types of products, and I do really enjoy having some diversity in my product portfolio, which I think a lot of product managers get to experience, especially if you're working at small companies. But what I really have a passion for doing, in addition to like external products or revenue generating products, is working on internal products. And I've realized the more I talk to people, it's not really something you're ever especially trained on in a lot of product management tracks. And it's something that as I talk to people who use internal products, they seem to like unanimously agree that they're usually not the best products to use. So I wanted to take this time to sort of give you guys a couple of tips I've learned on building internal products. And this presentation kind of has two parts to it. The first, I'm going to clarify what I mean when I'm talking about internal products, because that's something that's sort of used as a catchphrase. And the second component is just giving you some tips for prioritizing, designing, and then like navigating the political field of dealing with internal products. So the first thing, a really good place to start, I guess, is what do I mean by internal products? I think usually we think it means like a product used by people inside the company, right? And I want to say that it is and it isn't. So there's basically two types of internal tools. There's business tools, which you see on the left side. So business tools are typically things that we buy. So that would be like benefits, payroll management, project management, CRM software. But if it's not in the core competency of your business, you can usually just buy a subscription or get a license to use somebody else's products. And that's not really what I'll be talking about today. What I want to talk about is the type of products I'm going to call service enabling applications. And that's basically when your primary product or service actually requires some kind of human touch. So some industries don't really use these at all, but what you see really commonly in media or advertising are things like content management systems or asset management systems. You see in inventory management systems for any business that's built on subscription or rental models. You might see like fleet management systems that are similar. And this is basically when your company builds a tool internally to be used by other people at your company. And yeah, so it's very common if you need a team internally that's managing what you're actually selling. And the features are pretty common across service enabling applications. So typically it's hosted at a singular URL. Sometimes it's blocked by like a VPN, but you have a login to it. And it can be used by a lot of different groups at your organization. So account managers would use it to work on like asset management or account management. You'd see BD might use it for tracking milestones. And it does have like a lot of impact, and there are really common features that you see across, whether it's content management or inventory management. You tend to see like a browsable library. You see custom account details or details about the specific instance. So for example, at Omaze, we use a content management system to manage our campaign details. You usually see custom like creation, read, update, delete functions. You'd see tagging to categorize all your instances or statuses of something that might be draft or live or closed. And then there's usually like an upload function. It could be a really simple upload function for like individual videos or photos, or it could be a bulk upload feature if you want to upload a CSV of maybe users or like large files. And then sometimes there's like a QA or approvals flow. So sometimes these tools are built specifically to speed up like partner approval processes or finance approval processes. But basically, it's an internal set that helps you allow your business to function. And so what I want to give now is some tips for how to actually manage and build these products. And so the first challenge that you'll realize when you're working on internal tools is that they're really, really hard to get prioritized. And the reason is you're literally paying people to use them. So there's not a lot of feedback. You typically don't A/B test things on internal tools. They don't generate revenue, so it's hard to compete with things that are really flashy or are generating revenue or are really big impact items. So prioritizing itself can be a really big challenge. And the first tip that I have for that is to try to keep it off your roadmap entirely. If you can contract out development of internal tools, that alleviates a lot of burden and allows your engineers to continue focusing on revenue generation products. And then if you want to take in like maybe 10% of your sprints, depending on how big your sprints are, it could be something like 1 to 4 points per sprint of just maintaining development of maybe really small features or fixing bugs. And that way you're still clued in, it's still part of your product set, and your engineers are still working on things that are actually like moving the business forward, but they don't have to stop generating revenue. The second tip I'd give for prioritization is to align it really closely with the goals of your user teams. So for example, if your Q1 partner goal for your like BD team is to create twice as many campaigns and you have a filtering feature that you have the requirements ready for, this would be a really good time to put that on the roadmap because you can align that with the increased flow of campaigns and really say that that's going to help the partnerships team get more campaigns out. And then the last thing to do is that metrics in products obviously are a really huge conversation, but for internal tools, I strongly suggest that there's only one product that matters, or the only one metric that matters, and it's like your holy grail metric, which is time saved per task. So a good way to think about this is to group all of the features into like basic tasks that the people using this tool are trying to accomplish. So for instance, at Omaze, it could be like publishing a campaign. And there are like 18 steps involved in publishing a campaign. And anything you can do to alleviate the speed of that process or the efficiency of that process, maybe reducing mistakes, all of that is a key metric that's saving publishing campaign time. So the next thing that's tricky with internal tool sets is that designing features is really different than what we're taught about designing features for externally facing products. As I said, you don't do A/B testing. You don't get a lot of user impact or like user feedback specifically about like how you'd like it to be used, because to be honest, we don't put that much user testing like input into designing internal tools. And typically there's like two big mistakes I found that are really common in designing internal products. And one is either that you basically like slap a graphical interface onto the API and make that a product, or you just automate human functions that aren't necessarily the most efficient or intelligent way to actually do that function, but it's how the business has been doing it for so long that you just turn it into an automated task. And neither one of those really helps the people using it do things more like intelligently and really help. It doesn't really help them alleviate any of the cognitive load of doing those tasks. So a couple tips for designing features. The first one is, since you already know that every user who's using these features is doing it to do their job, a good way to write stories instead of writing our typical user stories would be to write job stories. So user stories frame needs inside of personas and kind of like abstract motivations. And job stories frame needs inside of situational outcomes. So they're much more refined. And so an example would be if I wanted to write a user story for a particular feature, I might say, as a partnerships coordinator, I want a preview function so that I can collect feedback. And a job story is pretty similar, but it's written a little bit differently. So I would say, like, when I'm doing this task, I want this improvement for this outcome. So the same story would say, when I'm ready to publish a campaign page, which tells you where they are in the workflow, I want to send a preview link to our partners so that I can collect their feedback. It's a tiny difference, but it can really alleviate, I think, a lot of confusion in trying to go back and forth in the context switching between external products and internal products. And if you noticed in that user story, when I wrote like the job story for it, I didn't say partnerships coordinator, because my second tip for feature design on internal products is to just democratize user permissions. I think some organizations I found have like specific best practices that they like to keep. So for example, it could say you only want people that are management level to have the power to publish a campaign. And in my opinion, that's one of those things where that could be something that's organizationally true now, but it's probably going to change, and it should change if you're getting to scale. And it's really best to design user permissions on internal tools to just be flat and not have to deal with letting certain people have certain privileges. Just make one user role and have everything be transparent and accessible. And if you need to actually design a process around that, that's fine, but you don't have to go back 2 years later when the business is 3 times as big and has roles that didn't exist 3 years before and change all those user permissions, which can be like a really nasty build. And so the last thing is don't forget about like pagination, load times, and search. So basically, when your key metric is time saved per task, you don't want to, that metric is like blown away if you have to spend like 5 minutes waiting for every single page to load, or if you have to spend 5 minutes searching through a browsable library of 10,000 items that doesn't really have like foresight or hindsight on pagination. So you have to click through every single page individually. And I think these are like features that are really easily forgotten, even though they should be pretty obvious. And I can tell you from personal experience that you do not want to stop building something that's like really fun and awesome to have to go back and implement pagination. It's just like a really painful thing to have to go back and build. So think about it ahead of time as you're building out anything that's going to essentially scale as you have more instances of whatever your business is. Be sure to implement those sort of efficiency and navigation features. So the last problem involved in building internal products and sort of dealing with their management is that they can be like a really political force. And people don't really talk about that much, but internal tools are like a huge operational resource. So they become kind of political. Like when you think about it, work is personal. So your workflow is personal, right? And efficiency and productivity of the business units really depends on how effective you are at like building and prioritizing these features. So my first tip for navigating politics is to appoint a product liaison from every team that uses this internal product. So a product liaison shouldn't really be hard to find. Basically, like on every team, like not necessarily every team, but on most teams, you see that there's somebody who is in charge of like onboarding new people onto that team or training them on these internal tools. Or maybe it's somebody on that team that's like constantly submitting bugs to you or is always slacking you about like the latest updates. Like that person already shows an interest in the product and already seems to have a really good grasp on the product. So it's important to like foster that relationship with them and really like use them as an ally and a resource for you to continue to try to like know what's important for these internal teams and help make sure that that message is getting spread. This can also be really, really helpful with change management. So every time you deploy new changes, sometimes like internal tools can be even trickier to explain how processes are changing when you've deployed a new feature. So your product liaison can really help alleviate some of that friction. You also want to keep a close eye for misalignment within teams. So typically this isn't like a huge existential political battle because it's just an internal product. It's not like the vision of your business. It doesn't like get that nasty. But one thing you have to keep in mind is that a lot of times the person who is like your key stakeholder in getting these features out tends to be the org leader for that team that's using it. And typically the org leader isn't the one who's actually like using the CMS every single day, right? So they may understand how it works, but they don't necessarily feel the pain of the scale of having to do some of these features that are like less than optimally built. So for example, if your key finance org leader believes that it's really important to upload to add a feature that has a new type of shipping code, and that's what they think is like the most important thing. But to load the page to get to the shipping code takes 3.5 minutes per page load. The person who's like the key finance leader may not necessarily have sat and tried to open those pages over and over and over again. So even saying it takes 3.5 minutes to load isn't necessarily going to convince her that that's the most important thing to do. And this is a time when the product liaison can be really helpful to step up as somebody who's like respected credibly within that team and voice, actually, it's really important that we tackle the page load times first and then get the new shipping code in there. And so the last thing I would say is like, be an evangelist. We definitely do not typically evangelize internal products. They're sort of just like a means to an end, and they're not really something people get super excited about. And I think that that's like a little backwards, because at the end of the day, like, your internal product is so related to what you're actually doing in your business that you should be excited about it. Like, every time we have a new shipping code, or we have like improved page load times, that's all just like time saved for that team that allows them to go do like more creative and more awesome things. So I think, like, as businesses scale and change, the tools and the team changes with it. And it's important that you sort of track the story of those internal tools and how that really has impacted the team's overall ability to do their job. So the reality is that, like, a lot of coworkers may spend all day looking at just the email and this internal product. So it's a huge deal for them, even though it may not be like engineering or product's most exciting thing to release. So it's just really important to make sure like you're supporting your internal users and really helping them through that process. So that's basically all that I have for this. So are there any questions?
Awesome. Thanks so much, Ariel, for a great presentation too. It was really interesting. I did note that everybody is welcome to type in their questions now, so we can start taking those. One thing I'd love for you to discuss is how do you get people behind an internal product if it's something that not necessarily everyone can see as value?
Yeah, so I think like being able to articulate the value of any specific feature that goes out, a lot of times like it's, we're not necessarily talking about building the CMS to begin with. Like, typically businesses would have already had to have had something in place. And so really the like evangelism and the traction to get behind any sort of improvement comes from being able to recognize where teams are experiencing that friction and where you can come in with your product mindset and help with that. So one thing I've noticed is that a lot of teams don't necessarily speak up a lot. Like, they're not necessarily involved in the product roadmap discussions. So they don't have an opportunity to say like, hey, actually, if we could build this new feature, it would be really awesome for us to not have to do this thing manually. And it has all this business impact because we've got now, let's say 45 minutes per week saved on a team of 10 people. And at the end of the day, like, that's just the same product math that we'd be doing on any feature. You just take like what the impact of the time saved there is and then multiply it by the impact.
Right. Okay. Awesome. Our next question is from Hoy. Can you give other examples of job story versus user story, or maybe go over a little bit more in detail the example that you shared?
Sure. So a job story, the key difference, I think, is a job story specifically outlines where in the workflow somebody is when they need the feature. So in my example, one of the key differences is that a user story would say something like, I want to be able to have a preview function. I want to be able to like share a preview. Whereas a job story would say, okay, but when do you need to share a preview, and what information do you need to be getting back to do the ultimate task that you need? So I think when you think about a job story, it's specifically like what came before it in the set of tasks that you're doing in your workflow, and then what do you need to go to next in the workflow?
Okay, awesome. Our next question is from Harris. He said, very informative session. How do you adopt or implement a process to improve productivity and faster delivery with a scattered team like remotely located?
Do you mean like for a remote engineering team, or a remote like internal user team of this product? Or either?
Response.
So,
I would imagine it's with the users.
So can you repeat the question real quick?
Sure. How do you adopt or implement a process to improve productivity for faster delivery when you have a team that's scattered remotely?
So the major way to improve productivity is essentially to have a process and stick to it. And then I think one of the things you have to do with good processes is treat them almost like we treat product development, where you have to be able to iterate on your process. So with remote teams, I think one of the tricky things is being available at specific times of day. So stand-ups can be really helpful for making sure everybody syncs up and is able to bring up, like, at one time, we all have a shared expectation, right? Which is that we share what we're blocked by and we're shared what we're working on. And I think being able to then sort of stack rank what's the most important thing for the team to work on sort of helps improve that process.
Okay. And our next question is from Igor. Let's see. How do you recommend building consensus among different business units?
One of the key ways to do that, I think, is to try to figure out what they have in common. So I think consensus building is obviously like a huge skill for product managers. A lot of times it involves a compromise. So sometimes there's like a trade-off. I feel a little bit like sometimes as a product manager, like I have like, a basket of things that I can metaphorically give out to certain teams, and you have to make sure that that's balanced. So there are definitely teams whose like needs always have more direct impact on revenue or productivity, but you're not necessarily helping the business by always putting that team's needs first. So I think consensus building can be really helpful, or can be a lot easier if you've made sure that like every team feels heard across the way. And ultimately, like you are going to have to say no to so many teams, and consensus building is a lot less painful if you feel like you already have a really strong relationship with that person.
Yeah, definitely. That makes a lot of sense. Thanks. Our next question is from Markel. What is a good strategy for a product manager to introduce agile methodologies as at a brand new startup?
That's a good question. I think from a product standpoint, I guess my first like instinct is to caution. I think a lot of product managers at startups also end up playing like a scrum master role, and that's fine. Like as the team scales, that's typically like it's a very small team of people. But I would caution, like ultimately, it's really the engineering team that's going to benefit the most from being in charge of their own agile processes and in charge of like their own scrum methodology. I think the biggest way that a product manager can help implement that is obviously there's a ton of research around product iterations and product development being a lot more lean and just a lot quicker and more effective on like agile methodology. So I think really keeping your product hat on without necessarily meddling too much in engineering, because otherwise you end up sort of spreading yourself really, really thin.
Right. Let's see. Our next question is from here. Sorry, we had a few come in, so just let's see. Okay, this one is from Soa. How can you identify flaws in a process or points where automation can interfere and where it can make a difference?
So actually, I like the question of automation interfering, because I do think sometimes that is a thing. I think that unless you have, so the two ways to do this is one, use automation to identify flaws. So logging is really helpful in this. I think that's something else to keep in mind when you're thinking about things that are kind of in the background, like pagination, load times, or search, is having good logging. So like if there's functions that continuously throw an error, you wouldn't really know that. Like you might hear that from people using the product to be like, oh, it's always throwing an error. But if it's an inconsistent bug to reproduce, that's going to be really hard to sort of verify. We don't usually put logging on internal products. And like that is something where that's a much easier way to identify that flaw and identify like, actually the way we automated this like might have been over-engineered, and maybe it would be less friction to actually leave this part manually. And then I think like the flip side of that question is like, where can automation improve? Is I always try to think about it as like, I think especially on internal products, we think about automating functions that are like rote, that aren't particularly intelligent. But I like to think about the best features to automate are the ones where you can gain some sort of like intelligent capacity by automating it. So how can you make your users smarter? So like one thing to think about is like, how can you run something programmatically so that you can actually get data that informs your users and informs your business?
Awesome, thank you. And let's see, we have time for one or two more questions. So this next question is from Kyle. What is the best way to communicate how to best use internal tools? Like, do you use documentation, tutorials, or hands-on training?
All of those. It kind of depends on how big your team is. Tutorials isn't, I did tutorials for, at my last company, we had a lot of like we had a lot of offices that were not from headquarters. So eventually we became big enough, like with 500 people, where I did start running video tutorials on how to use things. That would be like a full-on learning management system, but I think that that works on really, really big companies. Hands-on training, I would definitely say for really large releases, it's super important in order to actually reap the benefits of the features you released, that your team knows how to use the product, right? So like if it's a really confusing set of features, you haven't bought yourself or the business any time by actually releasing it. So there's definitely a time and place to do hands-on training, but documentation is really easy. Like if your team is small enough and you feel like they're all like up to speed, you haven't released any like crazy changes, just having really clear release notes internally can be super helpful. Otherwise, like I really like the idea of just doing like FAQs or like a user guide internally, like a cute little PDF of just how to use it. The benefit of doing documentation is that people don't always keep up with emails like in the long term. And if you have sort of like maybe every quarter you release a little PDF of all the major changes you've made to your internal systems, that way anybody who's like new to the team can use those documents to really like get up to speed.
Awesome. Yeah, documentation definitely really works. And I like the idea of releasing quarterly updates.
Yeah.
So cool. And our last question is from Kevin. How can you best influence stakeholders when a key metric is, or like steps per process has been missed or under designed?
So I think like how can you influence stakeholders? You basically have to, I don't know, if it's been under designed, I think you have to redesign it. Like you have to essentially come up with what the alternative solution is and then come up with a really compelling presentation for why it's a better solution. If steps have been missed, like one of the things to keep in mind is like that really damages credibility with the stakeholder team. And so again, going back to like making sure that I really feel heard, also being able to review in your product process, like how did you miss those steps, and how can you sort of prevent that in the future? Typically speaking, I think steps are missed because as product people, we tend to make assumptions, especially when you're building something really quickly, like internal tools, which don't typically get the same product cycle that external tools do. So it is important that you actually go through and like take time to sit with users and like really pay attention to what they're actually doing and what they actually need to achieve versus what we think they might need to achieve, because the reality is like they may not be there yet in that process.
Awesome, thank you. And thank you so much again for a great presentation and taking the time to answer all those questions.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Awesome. And before we let you go, just one final question. Would you share your advice for aspiring product managers?
Sure. So my advice for aspiring product managers is to always think about products. So like every product, like so much that you touch in the world is a product. And I think when you start thinking really critically about how did this work? How do you think that the person who came up with this feature came up with this feature, and start sort of unpacking how things work? A lot of times as product managers, like especially like when we're explaining to new product people, like what product is, we focus a lot on like revenue impact or on like, business change. And the reality is like a really good product manager is somebody who can unpack something and repack it back up. So I think just starting to look at the world really critically with an architectural mind will get you like so far ahead and being able to talk to different product people in different industries and be able to make yourself competent in those different products.
Awesome. Thank you again, Ariel. Really appreciate you being here. And thanks to everyone who joined us today. To get more information about us, you can go to productschool.com, and we'll both have a great day.
Bye.
Bye.